couple of nights ago, I was trying to pray about a terrible tragedy that had happened in one of our programs. I felt a heavy burden pressing down on me, and as I opened my heart to pray about that situation, a wave of other concerns flooded my mind. Friends who had lost their jobs when the economy shut down, family members who still have jobs but work in healthcare where they are exposed to the coronavirus every day, adult rehabilitation centers whose income has disappeared, friends and family members who have lost all of their savings, friends who are living on the street, members of our congregation who are trapped in unhealthy and ungodly lifestyles, friends who have family members trapped in dangerous parts of the world, family members who are mourning the loss of loved ones, friends who are battling cancer, and then just the general disorientation and uncertainty of the times we're living in. A phrase came into my mind as I prayed, as more and more faces appeared before me. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. That's how I felt, overwhelmed with sorrow. I had to stop praying, and for a while I had to shut down all of my emotions completely. I remember speaking to one of my close friends a number of years ago, right after she discovered that all 3 of her beautiful children had been molested by different people. I said to her, "Don't you just want to cry and let it all out?" And she said, "I can't start to cry because once I start crying, I won't be able to stop." Her sorrow was overwhelming. Do you know how it feels to be overwhelmed by sorrow? I remember a few years ago talking to one of my friends, a prayer warrior who doesn't have an easy life. We were discussing the distressing state of our country and our world. And even though she prays faithfully about these things, she said, "I can't think about this all the time. I get overwhelmed." Overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. That's what Jesus said to his close friends when he went with them to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. This is from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 26. He took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." In a way, that's what our Good Friday service is about. It's about keeping watch with Jesus, keeping watch with him in sorrow. But like Peter, James, and John, we can't handle it for long. We would prefer to rush on to Easter Sunday, but it's good on Good Friday to keep watch and remember. Jesus was overwhelmed with sorrow. He asked his friends to keep watch with him, but when he rose from prayer and went back to his disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. They couldn't handle it. We can't handle it. Jesus' friends went to sleep to escape from the sorrow. Some people drink to escape from the sorrow. Some people eat to escape from the sorrow. Some people shop to escape from the sorrow. Some people take street drugs or prescription drugs to escape from the sorrow. Some people watch mindless TV shows to escape from the sorrow. Some people play video games to escape from the sorrow. Some people surround themselves with music or crowds to escape from the sorrow. Not these days, 6 feet apart. But no matter what, the sorrow is always there waiting. Jesus tells us to come to him with our sorrow. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." We can come to Jesus and put our sorrows on him and take his rest. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus felt the weight of all the sorrows we have put on him. And he felt the weight of all the sorrows people have not put on him. Whether we choose to put our sorrows on him, or whether we choose to try to drown them out in different ways, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus felt the weight of all of those sorrows. The sorrows of the whole world, your sorrows and my sorrows, every sorrow of every person who has ever lived from the time of creation to the time he comes again. I feel overwhelmed by my own sorrow. And when I was praying, I felt overwhelmed by the sorrows of maybe 100 people. I felt overwhelmed, but Jesus was overwhelmed My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death, he said. And he wanted to escape as badly as we do. My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Jesus wanted to escape as badly as we do. Being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like great drops of blood falling to the ground. According to the writer to the Hebrews, Jesus offered up his prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears. Jesus wanted to escape from sorrow as badly as we do, but he chose not to escape. He chose to be overwhelmed. Not as I will, but as you will, he said to his Father. May your will be done. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus allowed himself to be overwhelmed by sorrow so that we would never have to be. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows, says the prophet Isaiah. Yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him, and afflicted. Jesus carried our sorrows along with the sorrows of those who don't understand what he did, who don't care what he did, who are fiercely opposed to what he did. But today we keep watch to remember what he did for us, for love. At a recent officers' retreat, we were ministered to by a beautiful couple. The wife was completing her degree in counseling and was already working as a family counselor. I had the opportunity to be in a small group with her, and I was struck by how kind and sympathetic she was. Just the qualities you want in a counselor. But I was also struck by how good she seemed, and I wondered if I could ever go to a counselor who was really that good. I could just picture sharing my deepest secrets with her, and maybe she would try to hide her shock and disgust, but inside she would be thinking, oh, I can't believe this. This is terrible. As I sat with this lovely lady, I thought that maybe I wouldn't want to go to a good counselor. I might want to go to a bad counselor. I would want to go to someone who had been through what I had been through, who knew where I was coming from, and who would never be shocked or horrified. And then I realized that's what kind of counselor Jesus is. Because of Good Friday, Jesus is not just a good counselor. He's the wonderful counselor. He knows the depth of my sin and sickness, not just from intellectual observation, but from experience. The perfect, holy, righteous, sinless, spotless Son of God experienced our sins on the cross. He found out what it was like to be a sinner separated from God. The Apostle Peter says, he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree. He didn't bear our sins on his body. He bore them in his body. He didn't carry our sins safely wrapped up in hefty garbage bags. Instead, as one of our worship songs says, he drank the world's sin. He was covered by and contaminated with and defiled by all of the sin, sorrow, depression, addiction, violence, and perversion that clings to us and fills us, all of it. In the Old Testament, as a sign to the nation of Judah, God called the prophet Ezekiel to bake a special kind of bread in the sight of the people, using human excrement for fuel. This was to demonstrate how the people would eat defiled food among the nations in their exile. But Ezekiel asked to be excused from the defilement. He told God that he had never defiled himself with anything unclean, and he didn't want to start now. And God let him off the hook. He told him he could eat his bread baked over cow manure instead. God let the prophet Ezekiel off the hook, but he did not let his own son off the hook. His son was defiled. On the cross, the sinless Son of God learned what it was to be a sinner. As the Apostle Paul puts it, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us. On the cross, Jesus became a sinner. He learned the humiliation of sin as he hung naked on the cross. He learned the separation of sin as he cried out to his Father in the words of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He learned how sin feels and tastes. Now, I can understand that God required Jesus to pay the penalty for our sin. I can understand the theological necessity for that. But that Jesus became sin for me, that he allowed his holy mind and heart and body to be defiled with sin for me, to be defiled by your sin and my sin and the sin upon sin upon sin upon sin of every person who has ever lived or who ever will live, this I cannot fathom. Amazing love. How can it be? Jesus was crushed by our sin. As the prophet Isaiah says, it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. That's the NIV, or as the NASB has it, the Lord was pleased to crush him. Jesus wanted to avoid the defilement of sin more than the prophet Ezekiel did, and certainly more than you and I do. But he chose not to avoid it. He chose to feel the full weight of it. When they offered Jesus wine mixed with gall to dull the pain, to deaden his senses, to erase the humiliation, to ease the shame, Jesus refused it. He chose to be crushed instead. Not as I will, but as you will, he said to his Father. May your will be done. On the cross of Calvary, Jesus allowed himself to be crushed by sin so that we would never have to be. We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, says the Apostle Paul. Jesus was crushed by our sins, along with the sins of those who don't understand what he did, who don't care what he did, who are fiercely opposed to what he did. But today, we keep watch to remember what he did. He was overwhelmed by sorrow so we could have peace. He was crushed by sin so we could be saved. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed.